Let me ask you a question. Have you ever stopped reaching out to someone and suddenly noticed that things started to change? Maybe the messages slowed down. Maybe the silence became noticeable. Maybe you started wondering what was going on inside his mind. Now, here is something many people don't fully understand about human psychology. When communication suddenly stops, the mind does not simply move on. Instead, it starts asking questions. The human brain dislikes uncertainty. When a pattern changes, especially in relationships, the mind immediately tries to figure out why. And when you stop reaching out to a man, a very specific mental process often begins. At first, he notices the silence. The phone that used to light up with your message stays quiet. The conversations that once happened naturally are suddenly missing. That moment creates awareness. Then curiosity begins to grow. He may start wondering what changed. Did something happen? Are you upset? Are you busy? Or maybe, are you pulling away? You see, silence can sometimes reveal things that constant communication hides. When someone is always present, their presence can start to feel normal, expected, routine. But when that presence disappears, the mind begins to recognize the space that person once filled. And that is when reflection begins. A man may start replaying past conversations, remembering moments you shared, thinking about the role you played in his daily life. But here is the most important part. When you stop reaching out, you are no longer pushing the connection forward. The responsibility quietly shifts. Now the real question becomes simple. Will he step forward to close the distance, or will the silence continue? Because what happens next often reveals more about his true level of interest than words ever could. When you stop reaching out to a man, the very first thing that usually begins to happen in his mind is curiosity. Human beings are naturally wired to search for patterns and consistency. When something becomes part of our daily rhythm, our brain quietly starts expecting it. It becomes familiar, predictable, and almost automatic. So when that pattern suddenly disappears, the mind notices immediately. Think about how communication normally develops between two people. At first, there is excitement. Messages go back and forth. Conversations happen regularly. Maybe you check in with him during the day, ask how things are going, or send something that reminds you of him. Over time, that contact becomes part of his routine. He may not even consciously think about it, but his mind becomes used to the idea that you will show up in his phone, in his notifications, or in his day. Now imagine that one day, that pattern changes. The message that usually comes in the morning doesn't appear. The casual conversation in the evening doesn't happen. The phone stays quiet where your name used to appear. At first, the brain simply notices the difference. It's a small signal, but it stands out because the routine has shifted. The human mind is very sensitive to broken patterns. When something familiar disappears, the brain automatically begins asking questions in order to restore understanding. He may glance at his phone and realize he hasn't heard from you. At that moment, the first thought might be simple curiosity. Maybe you're busy. Maybe you had a long day. Maybe something came up. In the beginning, the mind often looks for harmless explanations. But as more time passes without hearing from you, the curiosity begins to grow stronger. Now the brain starts filling the silence with possibilities. He might begin replaying the last conversation you had together. Was everything normal? Did the conversation end on a good note? Did he say something that could have been misunderstood? The interesting thing about curiosity is that it keeps the mind active. When someone always knows exactly what to expect from a person, their brain doesn't spend much energy thinking about it. Predictability creates comfort, but it also reduces mental focus. However, uncertainty has the opposite effect. When a person suddenly becomes uncertain about something, their mind begins paying closer attention. That's exactly what silence can create. Instead of your presence being automatic, it becomes noticeable through its absence. And that absence triggers mental engagement. Now he may start checking his phone a little more often than usual. Not necessarily in a dramatic way, but enough to notice the quiet. He might open his messages to see if you wrote something earlier. He may scroll through previous conversations between the two of you. This is where curiosity begins turning into reflection. The mind doesn't like unanswered questions, so it tries to find clues. He might start remembering things you talked about recently. Maybe you mentioned being stressed about something. Maybe you hinted at needing space. Maybe you simply sounded different in your tone. The brain becomes a detective trying to connect the dots. Another psychological factor also begins to play a role here, and that is the human tendency to focus more on things that are temporarily unavailable. When something is always within reach, the mind treats it as ordinary. But when access to that thing becomes limited or uncertain, attention increases. This doesn't mean silence automatically makes someone obsessed or emotional. That would be unrealistic. But it does mean that the brain becomes more aware of the change. Curiosity keeps the person mentally engaged with the situation. And when the mind is engaged, it starts paying closer attention to the person connected to that curiosity. Now here is where things become interesting from a psychological perspective. During silence, the brain often fills the empty space with imagination. Without new information coming in, the mind begins replaying old information. He may remember conversations where you made him laugh. He may think about moments where the two of you connected on something meaningful. He may remember small details about your personality or the way you interact with him. These thoughts may appear casually, sometimes when he is doing something unrelated. Maybe he's driving somewhere, maybe he's working, maybe he's just scrolling on his phone. But the silence creates space for those thoughts to return. Curiosity acts like an open loop in the brain. Until the loop is closed with an answer, the mind tends to revisit it again and again. And the longer the silence lasts, the more the brain becomes aware that something is different. But there is another important aspect to understand here. Curiosity doesn't just focus on what happened, it also focuses on what might happen next. He may begin wondering whether you will eventually reach out again. He may wonder if you are waiting for him to make the first move. He may even consider sending a message just to see how you respond. This is where the psychological shift begins. Instead of the connection being driven primarily by your effort, the silence introduces a moment where he becomes mentally involved in the dynamic. His thoughts start asking questions about you, about the connection, and about what the silence means. And curiosity is powerful because it often leads to action. When the brain becomes too curious about something, it naturally looks for ways to resolve that curiosity. The simplest way to resolve it is by reaching out, starting a conversation, or checking in. But whether he acts on that curiosity or not depends on many factors, including his personality, his level of interest, and how much he values the connection. The key point here is not that silence magically changes someone's feelings. The real point is that silence interrupts the normal pattern and activates curiosity in the mind. And once curiosity is activated, attention follows. When attention follows, the person begins thinking about you in a more focused way than before. That is the first psychological shift that often occurs when you stop reaching out. Silence creates a gap in the routine, and that gap invites the mind to start asking questions. Those questions keep your presence alive in his thoughts, even when there are no new messages being exchanged. When you stop reaching out to a man, the second psychological shift that often happens in his mind is something deeper than curiosity. After the initial questions appear, the mind begins to reassess value. This happens because human beings have a natural tendency to underestimate things that are always available and to notice things more clearly once they become less accessible. This does not mean people intentionally take others for granted. In most cases, it happens quietly and unconsciously. When someone is consistently present in our daily life, the brain slowly adapts to that presence. It becomes part of the normal environment, like background music that plays so often you stop noticing it. If you have ever lived near a busy road, you may remember how loud the traffic seemed when you first arrived. Every car passing by caught your attention. But after living there for a while, your brain adjusted. The noise did not disappear, but your mind stopped focusing on it because it became familiar. Relationships can sometimes follow a similar psychological pattern. If you are always the one reaching out, always initiating conversation, always checking in, your presence becomes expected. Not necessarily unappreciated, but expected. The brain gets used to the pattern and stops analyzing it as something special. Now imagine that the pattern suddenly stops. The messages that once appeared regularly are no longer there. The conversations that were part of the daily routine disappear. The attention that once flowed naturally becomes quiet. This is where the mind begins reassessing value. When something that used to be constant suddenly becomes absent, the brain notices the space it left behind. Instead of blending into the background, your presence becomes more visible through its absence. He may start realizing that certain conversations no longer happen the way they used to. Maybe you were the person who brought humor into his day. Maybe you were the one who asked thoughtful questions about what he was going through. Maybe your messages were the ones that appeared during moments when he needed a break from stress. While those things were happening regularly, his brain may not have paused to fully evaluate their importance. But when those interactions disappear, the difference becomes noticeable. The mind begins asking a different kind of question now. Instead of simply wondering why you stopped reaching out, it starts recognizing what your presence actually contributed. Sometimes people do not recognize the emotional comfort someone provides until that comfort is no longer there. For example, imagine someone who always checks in with you after a long day. At first, it feels normal. It becomes part of the routine. But if that person suddenly stops doing it, the quiet may feel unfamiliar. You may not have realized how much you appreciated that small gesture until it disappeared. This is how value reassessment works inside the mind. When something becomes less available, the brain pauses and evaluates it more carefully. It begins measuring how meaningful that presence actually was. In the context of relationships, this reassessment can cause a man to think more seriously about the connection. He might begin remembering how easy it was to talk to you compared to others. He may recall the way conversations with you felt different, more relaxed, or more engaging. Without your consistent communication filling the space, the mind now has room to think about the connection itself. Another important psychological factor comes into play here as well, and that is the principle of contrast. People often understand value more clearly when they experience contrast. For example, you may not fully appreciate quiet until you spend time in a loud environment. You may not fully appreciate comfort until you experience discomfort. Similarly, when your attention and communication are always present, they can feel normal. But when that attention disappears, the contrast makes the difference clearer. The mind begins comparing what is happening now with what used to happen before. Before, there were regular conversations. Before, there were messages that appeared naturally. Before, the connection felt active. Now there is silence. That contrast can create awareness. He may start recognizing that the dynamic of the relationship has changed, and that recognition often leads the brain to think more deeply about what the connection actually means. Sometimes this realization happens gradually. It may begin with small observations, like noticing that his phone feels quieter than usual. Then it may turn into reflection about the conversations you used to have. He may begin thinking about the energy you brought into interactions. Maybe you were encouraging during difficult times. Maybe you showed interest in the things he cared about. Maybe you simply made everyday conversations feel lighter. The mind naturally begins reviewing those moments. This does not mean every man will suddenly feel intense emotion or immediately react. People process these realizations differently depending on their personality and emotional awareness. But the psychological mechanism itself is common. When availability decreases, attention increases. And when attention increases, the brain becomes more capable of recognizing value. There is another important layer to this as well. When you stop reaching out, the flow of effort in the relationship changes. If you were previously the one initiating communication most of the time, your silence removes that source of momentum. Now the connection can only continue if he decides to contribute effort as well. This shift can cause him to look at the situation more clearly. Instead of simply responding to messages that appear, he now has to consider whether he wants to initiate interaction himself. That moment of choice often forces the mind to evaluate the relationship more honestly. He may ask himself whether he enjoys talking with you, whether he misses the conversations, whether the connection matters enough to step forward and restart communication. All of these thoughts are part of the value reassessment process. When someone's presence becomes less automatic, the brain becomes more aware of what that presence meant. Sometimes that awareness leads to renewed effort. Sometimes it leads to deeper reflection about the connection. And sometimes it simply brings clarity about how much someone truly values the relationship. But the key point remains the same. When constant availability changes, the mind often begins reevaluating the importance of what used to be there. And in many cases, that reevaluation reveals something that routine once kept hidden: the true value of a person's presence. When you stop reaching out to a man, another important psychological process often begins inside his mind, and that process revolves around memory. Once curiosity appears and the brain starts reassessing the situation, the mind naturally begins revisiting past experiences. This is something the human brain does automatically whenever there is silence or emotional distance. Without new conversations or interactions filling the space, the mind starts looking backward instead of forward. Think about how communication usually works when two people are regularly talking. New messages arrive, new conversations happen, and the mind focuses mostly on what is happening in the present moment. The brain is busy processing new information, so it does not spend much time reflecting on past interactions. But when communication stops, that flow of new information disappears. Suddenly, there is space. And when the brain has space, it begins replaying memories. A man may start remembering the last few conversations the two of you had. At first, these thoughts might appear casually, almost like small flashes. He might recall something funny you said, or a moment where the conversation felt easy and natural. These memories often come up during quiet moments of the day, such as when he is driving, taking a break, or scrolling through his phone. The mind tends to revisit emotional experiences when it is searching for meaning or trying to understand a change. Because you are no longer reaching out, the brain begins looking back at previous interactions to make sense of the silence. It starts reviewing the relationship like a mental recording, replaying pieces of it to see if something important stands out. He may remember how the two of you first started talking. He might recall the early excitement of getting to know each other, the conversations that lasted longer than expected, the moments where the connection felt genuine. These memories do not always appear all at once. They often come back slowly, one moment at a time. The human brain has a fascinating tendency when it comes to memory, especially emotional memory. When people are separated from someone they used to interact with regularly, they may experience feelings of loneliness, isolation, or disconnection. Their mind often highlights meaningful or positive moments more strongly than neutral ones. This happens because emotional experiences leave stronger impressions on the brain. When those experiences are revisited during absence, they can feel even more noticeable. For example, he might remember the way you supported him when he mentioned something stressful in his life. Maybe you listened carefully when he talked about something important. Maybe you encouraged him in a moment where he needed reassurance. At the time those conversations happened, they may have felt like ordinary interactions. But when the mind revisits them later, especially during silence, they can take on greater emotional weight. Memory becomes a tool the brain uses to evaluate the connection. He may also remember the tone of your conversations. Perhaps there was a certain comfort when the two of you talked. Maybe your conversations felt more relaxed compared to interactions he has with other people. When those interactions stop, the contrast becomes noticeable through memory. Another interesting thing about the human mind is that memory does not simply replay events like a camera recording. Instead, the brain reconstructs experiences based on emotions, impressions, and meaning. That means when he remembers past interactions with you, his mind is not just recalling the words that were spoken. It is also recalling how those interactions felt. Did he feel understood? Did he feel entertained? Did he feel relaxed? Did he feel energized by the conversation? These emotional impressions are often what the brain focuses on when it reviews memories. And when someone is no longer present in the same way they used to be, those emotional impressions can become clearer. This is why absence sometimes makes people reflect more deeply on a connection than they did when everything was happening in real time. Another factor that plays a role here is something psychologists often describe as mental looping. When the brain encounters an unanswered situation, it tends to revisit related memories repeatedly until it feels it has reached some kind of understanding. Because you stopped reaching out, his mind may continue revisiting moments between the two of you in an attempt to understand what the silence means. Did something change? Was there a signal he missed? Was the connection stronger than he realized? These questions encourage the brain to keep searching through memories for clues. Sometimes this reflection can even make certain moments feel more significant than they originally did. For instance, a simple conversation you once had might now appear more meaningful in his mind because it stands out against the current silence. This does not mean every memory will automatically become positive. The brain may also recall moments where communication felt confusing or uncertain. But the key point is that silence creates space for reflection, and reflection naturally leads the mind back through past experiences. As these memories surface, they can shape how he views the connection overall. If the majority of his memories with you are positive, supportive, or enjoyable, those memories may strengthen his appreciation of the relationship. The mind may begin recognizing that the connection brought something valuable into his daily life. On the other hand, if the connection was inconsistent or emotionally distant, those memories may lead him to different conclusions. Either way, the memory process helps the brain organize and evaluate the relationship. What makes this stage important is that reflection often brings awareness. When people are actively interacting every day, they rarely pause to analyze how they truly feel about someone. But when communication pauses, the mind gains the distance needed to examine those feelings. He may start recognizing that he actually enjoyed talking to you more than he realized before. He may notice that certain parts of his routine feel different without those conversations. Sometimes this awareness grows slowly, almost quietly. A random memory appears during the day, then another one later in the week. Each memory reminds him of the connection in a slightly different way. Over time, these reflections can create a clearer picture of what the relationship meant to him. That is why silence often triggers memory. Without new interactions to occupy the mind, the brain turns inward and begins reviewing what already happened. And during that process, emotions, experiences, and impressions that once felt ordinary can suddenly become more meaningful. When you stop reaching out to a man, the fourth psychological shift that often takes place in his mind has to do with investment. Up to this point, curiosity may have appeared, the mind may have started reassessing value, and memories of past interactions may have surfaced. But eventually, the situation reaches a moment where the mind quietly asks a very simple question: what happens next? When communication stops, the structure of the connection changes. Before the silence, there may have been a certain flow to the interaction. Maybe you were the one starting conversations more often. Maybe you were the one checking in first, asking how his day was going, or sending the message that reopened communication when things got quiet. When that effort is consistently coming from one side, the relationship develops a kind of momentum. Conversations keep happening because someone is always pushing the interaction forward. The connection keeps moving because there is energy being added to it. But when you stop reaching out, that momentum pauses. The movement that used to keep the connection active suddenly disappears and the situation becomes still. In that stillness, something important happens. The responsibility for the next step is no longer clear. Before, communication may have continued simply because you were initiating it. Now the silence introduces a moment where the next move must come from somewhere else. This is where the idea of investment becomes visible. Investment in a relationship is not just about words or feelings. It is about effort. It is about the willingness to move toward the connection instead of waiting for the connection to come toward you. When the pattern of communication changes, the mind begins evaluating whether the connection is worth that effort. At first, this evaluation may be subtle. He may notice that he has not heard from you in a while. Then he may begin wondering whether he should reach out. That thought alone represents the beginning of investment awareness. Instead of simply responding to messages that appear automatically, he now has to consider whether he wants to initiate contact himself. This moment can reveal a lot about how someone truly feels about the connection. If the conversations you had together were meaningful, engaging, or emotionally comfortable, he may start feeling the urge to restart communication. The silence might feel unusual enough that he considers sending a message just to see how you are doing. Sometimes it starts with a very simple thought. Something like, "I wonder what she's been up to," or "It's been a while since we talked." Those thoughts can slowly turn into action, especially if the connection left a positive impression on him. But the important thing to understand is that this moment of choice only appears when the dynamic changes. If someone is always receiving effort without needing to contribute much of their own, they rarely have to think about whether they should step forward. The interaction simply continues because someone else keeps it moving. Once that source of movement disappears, the mind has to decide what role it wants to play. This is why silence can sometimes reveal the true level of emotional investment in a relationship. Some people respond to that silence by stepping forward. They reach out, ask how you are doing, or restart the conversation. Their actions show that the connection matters enough for them to contribute effort. Other people may notice the silence but choose not to act. They may wait, assume you will eventually reach out again, or simply allow the distance to remain. Neither response happens by accident. Each one reflects how much importance the person places on maintaining the connection. This is not about judgment or blame. People invest differently in relationships for many reasons. Some may hesitate because they are unsure how the other person feels. Others may avoid reaching out because they are not emotionally ready for deeper involvement. But regardless of the reason, silence has a way of revealing patterns that constant communication can sometimes hide. When both people are contributing effort, a connection usually continues naturally. Conversations flow back and forth because each person is willing to move toward the other. But when effort comes mostly from one side, the relationship can appear stronger than it actually is. The activity of communication creates the impression of closeness, even if the investment is not equal. When you stop reaching out, that imbalance becomes easier to see. The silence removes the extra energy that was keeping the connection active. What remains is the other person's willingness or unwillingness to step forward. This moment can feel uncomfortable for some people because uncertainty appears again. You may not know whether he will reach out or remain silent, but that uncertainty also creates clarity. Instead of trying to interpret mixed signals or guess what someone might be feeling, you can simply observe what happens. Does he notice the silence? Does he make the effort to reconnect? Does he allow the distance to continue without action? These behaviors communicate information more clearly than long conversations ever could. Human actions often reveal priorities more honestly than words. Someone who values the connection usually finds a reason to maintain it. They send a message, start a conversation, or show curiosity about how you are doing. Someone who does not feel strongly invested may allow the silence to remain because the connection was never a priority for them in the first place. This is why stepping back sometimes reveals the true shape of a relationship. When you remove the effort you were constantly contributing, the connection must rely on mutual interest to survive. If that mutual interest exists, communication often returns naturally. If it does not, the silence continues, and that also provides an answer. The purpose of this psychological shift is not to manipulate anyone or force a reaction. Instead, it creates space for honesty. By stepping back, you allow the other person's level of investment to appear without pressure or persuasion. And once that investment becomes visible, you gain something that is often more valuable than constant communication: clarity about where the relationship truly stands.